The shipyard is sold. Eleanor Ashcombe heard the words across a dining table crowded with men who had spent the evening discussing ships they had never built. Her husband, Sebastian, Duke of Ashbourne, did not look at her when he said them. He lifted his wine instead, as though announcing the sale of Blackwater Yard were no more significant than dismissing a servant. Sir Edmund Vale sat 2 places away, smiling. Eleanor kept her hands beneath the table. Blackwater is protected by my marriage settlement. Your claim has been resolved, Sebastian replied. A few gentlemen exchanged uncomfortable glances. Admiral Harcourt, seated near the fireplace, studied his plate. Eleanor understood immediately. Sebastian had chosen an audience because he wanted no argument afterward. For 12 years, Blackwater Yard had built merchant vessels and naval cutters along the southern coast. Eleanor had learned there beside her father, standing on overturned crates while shipwrights taught her why oak twisted, why iron failed, and why a beautiful hull could still kill the men inside it. After her father's death, the yard became part of her settlement. After her marriage, Sebastian treated it as an embarrassing hobby. Sir Edmund leaned forward. His Grace merely recognized that a naval enterprise requires experienced leadership. Eleanor looked at him. My yard has delivered 19 seaworthy vessels, under male supervision. The laughter around the table was cautious. Sebastian did not laugh. That hurt more. Eleanor turned toward her husband. Tell Admiral Harcourt who redesigned the keel of the Resolute. Sebastian's jaw tightened. Not tonight. Tell him. Enough, Eleanor. Silence fell. Sebastian finally faced her. You possess an unfortunate talent for confusing enthusiasm with expertise. I will not allow this family to continue financing your experiments. The words were deliberate. He knew the truth. 3 years earlier, when the Resolute had failed its first trials, Eleanor had identified the imbalance that 2 engineers had missed. Sebastian had congratulated her privately. Publicly, he had allowed another man to accept the praise. Tonight, he went further. My wife, he told the table, has never designed a seaworthy vessel in her life. Eleanor felt something inside her become perfectly still. Sir Edmund smiled into his glass. She could have exposed Sebastian immediately. She possessed notebooks, calculations, dated correspondence, and preliminary drawings in her private archive at Blackwater. Instead, she rose. Then I trust you will never need one of my designs. Sebastian's expression changed for half a second. Eleanor left before anyone could answer. By 8 the next morning, Sebastian's solicitor arrived with the transfer papers. Blackwater Yard now belonged to Sir Edmund Vale. Her annual income from it was suspended, pending a review Sebastian had authorized. Her office was to be surrendered. The craftsman had been ordered to accept Vale's management or leave. Eleanor read every page. Sebastian had signed each one. That mattered. Whatever Vale had told him, Sebastian had not been tricked into putting ink on the document. He had chosen not to ask her, not to examine her accounts, and not to speak to the men who actually built the ships. She placed the papers back on the desk. Where is His Grace? London, Your Grace. Of course. He had arranged her humiliation and departed before he had to witness its consequences. Eleanor took her cloak. Blackwater lay less than 4 miles away. When she reached the yard, the gates were already guarded. Beyond them, hammers struck timber in a rhythm she had known since childhood. Her rhythm. A new sign bearing Vale's name was being raised over her father's. I'm sorry, Your Grace. Thomas Reed, the gatekeeper, could barely meet her eyes. Mr. Vale's orders. Eleanor looked past him toward the great construction shed. The unfinished naval prototype remained inside. Her prototype. A narrow, fast vessel designed to carry heavier guns without sacrificing stability. She had spent 31 months calculating the distribution of weight through the keel and ribs. Has anyone entered my drafting room? Thomas hesitated. That was answer enough. Who? Mr. Vale, 2 gentlemen from London, and Mr. Mercer. Eleanor's attention sharpened. Mercer? Nathaniel Mercer was the yard's senior clerk. He knew where every contract was stored, but he understood almost nothing about naval engineering. Where is he now? No one has seen him since dawn. Eleanor stepped closer to the gates. Thomas, listen carefully. No matter what Vale says, do not let them launch the prototype. His face paled. Before he could respond, Sir Edmund appeared on the balcony above the yard. Duchess, his voice carried easily. You are trespassing. Eleanor looked up at the man who now occupied her father's office. Then she noticed smoke, not from the furnaces. It curled through an upstairs window, her drafting room. Fire! Men began shouting. Eleanor rushed toward the gate, but the guard caught her arm. Let me through! Flames suddenly burst behind the glass. Her archive. Years of calculations. Experimental records, correspondence, and signed revisions were inside. Sir Edmund did not run toward the fire. He stood on the balcony watching Eleanor. That frightened her more than the flames. Near midnight, someone knocked softly at the servants' entrance of Ashcombe House. Eleanor found old Jacob Bell standing there. He had worked at Blackwater for 43 years. Both his hands were burned. "Jacob, don't call anyone." She pulled him inside. His coat smelled of smoke, and soot covered one side of his face. "I tried to save what I could," he whispered. From beneath his coat, he produced a charred piece of parchment. Eleanor recognized the handwriting immediately. Hers. It came from the prototype calculations. Only a portion survived, but it was enough. Someone had copied her private notebook. Then she saw the altered number. Her breath stopped. The measurement governing the forward frame had been reduced, not accidentally, deliberately. At full speed, with the guns loaded, the resulting stress could split the internal structure. "When is the Admiralty trial?" Eleanor asked. Jacob swallowed. 10 days. Then we warn Harcourt." Jacob caught her wrist. "There is something else." Fear filled his eyes. "Mr. Mercer discovered who changed the plans." Eleanor stared at him. "Where is Mercer?" Jacob's voice dropped almost to nothing. "He disappeared this morning." A sound came from the dark corridor behind them. Both turned. The handle of the servant's door slowly began to move. The handle turned again. Eleanor extinguished the lamp with one breath and pulled Jacob behind the pantry wall. His burned hand struck a shelf, but he swallowed the cry. The door opened. A thin line of moonlight crossed the floor. Someone entered. Eleanor could hear careful footsteps moving through the servants' corridor. Not the uncertain steps of a thief entering an unfamiliar house, but those of someone who knew exactly where to go. The footsteps stopped outside the pantry. Jacob's breathing quickened. Then a man's voice whispered from the darkness. "Your Grace?" Eleanor recognized it. "Thomas?" The Blackwater gatekeeper stepped forward, clutching his cap. "I followed Mr. Bell. I had to make certain no one else did." Eleanor relit the lamp. Jacob sagged against the wall. "You nearly killed me," he muttered. Thomas did not smile. "Mr. Vale has men watching the road." That changed everything. Eleanor locked the door before turning to Jacob. "Tell me exactly what happened." The old shipwright lowered himself into a chair. After the sale, Vale had ordered Eleanor's drafting room cleared. By late afternoon, 2 strangers arrived from London and began separating her papers into piles. Some were carried downstairs, others were burned. "I saw Mercer arguing with them," Jacob said. "He kept saying one drawing wasn't the same as the original." "The prototype?" Jacob nodded. Mercer had apparently compared the construction copy with an older set of Eleanor's calculations. Before sunset, he had slipped something inside his coat and left through the timber gate. No one had seen him afterward. Eleanor laid the burned fragment on the table. "Did Mercer change this measurement?" "No," Jacob answered immediately. He was frightened by it. Thomas leaned closer. There was another thing. Mr. Vale told the foreman the Admiralty trial had been moved forward. Eleanor froze. "From 10 days? 6. Someone wanted the vessel tested before questions could be asked." She went to the writing desk and pulled out paper. "I'll send directly to Admiral Harcourt." Jacob shook his head. "Vale already sent a report." "What report?" Thomas looked ashamed. "One blaming you." Eleanor's pen stopped. Vale claimed the prototype had been constructed from designs completed under Eleanor's management before the sale. If anything failed, the defect would belong to her. The trap was suddenly visible. Vale could steal a successful vessel, or bury Eleanor beneath a disastrous one. Either outcome served him. She wrote anyway. By dawn, a trusted maid carried the sealed letter toward the Admiralty office in Portsmouth. Eleanor kept the charred fragment hidden. It was not enough to prove sabotage. She needed the original plans, and Mercer. Sebastian returned shortly after noon. Eleanor met him in his study before he could remove his gloves. "You burned my archive." His head snapped toward her. "What?" "Vale's men entered my drafting room yesterday. Hours later, it was burning. I authorized the removal of business records. I authorized no fire. Yet you gave him the authority that put them in his hands." Sebastian's expression hardened. "You are determined to make every consequence of this sale my personal crime. You signed the sale because Blackwater was draining money. It made a profit last year, according to accounts controlled by your people." Eleanor stared at him. There it was again. Not ignorance, distrust. Sebastian had been given a choice between examining her records and believing Vale. He had chosen Vale. She placed a copied figure from the burned drawing on his desk. "The prototype plans have been altered." He glanced down. You cannot know that from one number. I designed it. That claim is precisely what Vale warned me you would make. For a moment, Eleanor could not speak. Sebastian continued, quieter now. Eleanor, stop. You are angry. I understand that. But if you publicly accuse the new owner of sabotage because you resent the sale, you will damage what remains of your reputation. My reputation? If the Admiralty becomes involved, it is already involved. She watched his face. The trial is in 6 days. Sebastian's confidence faltered. Only briefly, then let engineers determine whether the vessel is safe. They're building from falsified calculations. You have no proof, because the room containing my proof was burned. His jaw tightened. Eleanor stepped closer. If that ship breaks apart during the trial, sailors will die. I am asking you once, Sebastian. Use the authority you still possess. Demand that the trial be postponed. Silence stretched between them. This was the moment he could choose differently. Sebastian picked up the paper, then set it down. No. Eleanor felt the last fragile piece of her trust in him disappear. Very well. She turned toward the door. Where are you going? To find the proof you require. She began with Mercer's office. Vale had barred her from Blackwater, but Mercer rented 2 rooms above a chandlery near the harbor. The landlord allowed a duchess upstairs without argument. The door was unlocked. Inside, a chair lay overturned. Papers covered the floor. Someone had searched the room violently. Eleanor moved carefully. Mercer's account books were gone. His coat remained hanging by the window, which meant he had probably not planned to travel. On the desk stood an uncapped bottle of ink. She found blood beneath it. Not much. Enough. Then she noticed a rectangular patch of clean wood inside the bottom drawer. Something had recently been removed. Eleanor searched beneath the desk, behind the books, inside the cold fireplace. Nothing. She nearly left before remembering Mercer's habit of hiding his tobacco from his wife when she visited the yard. Never in a drawer. Always somewhere absurd. Eleanor examined the loose panel beneath the window seat. It lifted. Inside was a narrow ledger wrapped in sailcloth. She opened it. Dates, payments, ship numbers, names she did not recognize. Beside several entries was the same mark, V. Then she reached the final page. Mercer had written only one sentence. The Duke's sale was arranged before Vale ever inspected Blackwater. Below it was a date. Eleanor stared at the number. It was 6 weeks before Sebastian had told her the yard was losing money. Someone knocked hard downstairs. A man's voice followed. By order of Sir Edmund Vale, no one is to leave the building. Eleanor closed the ledger. Heavy footsteps began climbing the stairs. Eleanor had seconds. She pushed Mercer's ledger beneath her stays, lowered the window, and looked down. The alley was too far below to jump safely. The footsteps reached the landing. Then she noticed a narrow service door beside the fireplace. Eleanor slipped through it just as the main door opened. The passage led to a cramped staircase used by servants delivering coal. She descended quickly, emerging behind the chandlery while Vale's men searched the rooms above. She did not return to Ashcombe House. Instead, she went directly to the harbor. If Mercer's ledger was genuine, the sale of Blackwater had never been an ordinary business decision. Someone had spent weeks preparing Sebastian to believe the yard was failing. Eleanor rented a room above an inn and spread the ledger across the bed. Most entries meant little, until she recognized 3 ship names. All had been repaired at Blackwater. Each repair appeared beside payments made to an unfamiliar company, Crown Maritime Supply. The amounts were enormous, yet Eleanor had never hired such a supplier. Someone had been placing false expenses inside Blackwater's accounts. That was how the profitable yard had been made to appear insolvent. Sebastian had believed the numbers because he had never asked Eleanor to explain them. A knock interrupted her thoughts. Your Grace? It was Admiral Harcourt. Her letter had reached him. Eleanor showed him the burned calculation. His expression darkened. If this measurement is correct, the forward structure could fail. Then stop the trial. I cannot on this alone. Men may die. And if I cancel an Admiralty trial because a duke's angry wife produces half a burned drawing, Vale will accuse me of favoritism. Eleanor hated that he was right. She placed Mercer's ledger before him. This may prove fraud. Harcourt studied several pages. It proves suspicious payments. Not that Vale made them. Give me 48 hours. You have 36. The prototype sails at dawn the day after tomorrow. Eleanor looked up sharply. I was told 6 days. The schedule changed again this morning. Someone was accelerating everything. Harcourt closed the ledger. If you can find the original design or Mercer, I'll halt the trial myself. Eleanor returned to Blackwater after darkness. Thomas had arranged a way inside, through an old drainage passage beneath the timber yard. Her gown was ruined within minutes. She did not care. Jacob waited near the abandoned molding shed. I remembered something, he whispered. Before Mercer disappeared, he asked whether your father still kept duplicate plans in the old loft. Eleanor's heart quickened. The loft stood above the original shipwright's workshop, unused since her father's death. They crossed the yard separately to avoid the night watch. Inside, dust covered everything. Eleanor climbed the ladder and searched through old wooden cases until her fingers touched a familiar leather portfolio. Her father's initials were stamped into its cover. She opened it. Empty. Someone had arrived first. A floorboard creaked below. Eleanor extinguished her lantern. Voices entered the workshop. Vale was one of them. The other belonged to Sebastian. Eleanor remained perfectly still. You promised me the papers had been destroyed, Sebastian said. The relevant ones were. And Mercer? A pause. Mercer stole documents belonging to my company. That is not what I asked. Vale's voice became colder. You wanted Blackwater's debts removed from your estate before Parliament reviewed your finances. I solved that problem. You told me the yard was nearly bankrupt. It was becoming inconvenient. Sebastian lowered his voice. You manipulated the accounts. Eleanor pressed a hand over her mouth. For the first time, Sebastian sounded uncertain. Vale laughed softly. You signed because you wanted the money, Ashbourne. Do not suddenly pretend you were interested in how I obtained the figures. Silence. Then Sebastian said, postpone the trial. No. My wife believes the design was altered. Your wife believes Blackwater still belongs to her. If sailors die, they will not. You sound remarkably certain. Footsteps moved beneath Eleanor. She risked looking through a gap in the floorboards. Vale held something beneath his arm. A leather portfolio. Her father's portfolio. Sebastian reached for it. Vale pulled it away. You made your choice when you signed the contract. Then came a third sound, a crash from outside. Men shouted. Vale and Sebastian rushed from the workshop. Eleanor descended. Jacob appeared moments later. You heard them? Every word. Then His Grace knows. Yes, but knowledge did not erase what Sebastian had already done. Eleanor stepped outside and saw men running toward the unfinished prototype. Someone had released its supports. The enormous hull shifted inside the construction shed. Move! Jacob shouted. Timber screamed. The prototype rolled several feet before crashing against a supporting frame. Workers scattered. Eleanor ran toward them. Then Thomas appeared from beneath the hull, dragging a man by the shoulders. The man's face was bloodied, his clothing was soaked, but Eleanor recognized him. Mercer. His eyes opened weakly. Your Grace. She knelt beside him. Who altered my design? Mercer tried to speak, but blood touched his lips. Eleanor leaned closer. There were 2 copies. Where is the other one? Mercer gripped her sleeve. Not the plans. His frightened eyes moved toward Sebastian standing across the yard. The contract. Eleanor went still. What contract? Mercer's fingers tightened once. The Navy never bought Vale's ship. His voice fell to a whisper. They bought yours. Then he lost consciousness. Mercer was carried into the sail room while Jacob sent for a surgeon. Sebastian approached Eleanor across the yard. I heard what he said. So did I. Then we need to speak privately. Eleanor looked at him. Now you wish to speak privately? His face tightened. I was wrong about Vale. No, you were warned about Vale. You chose him anyway. Before Sebastian could answer, Admiral Harcourt entered the yard with 2 naval officers. Eleanor had sent Thomas for him the moment Mercer was found. Harcourt examined the damaged prototype, then turned to Vale. No repairs are to be made without Admiralty supervision. Vale remained calm. A minor accident, Admiral. And the trial will proceed. Eleanor stepped forward. It cannot. Vale smiled. You no longer possess authority here, but the Admiralty may. She told Harcourt what Mercer had revealed. The Admiral's expression changed. If the Navy contracted for Lady Ashbourne's design, I want the original agreement. Vale shrugged. Then search your archives. I intend to. By morning, Harcourt had found it. The original Admiralty contract identified the vessel by Eleanor's design number, BA-17. Yet the copy submitted by Vale after purchasing Blackwater identified the same vessel as EV-4. Someone had altered the contractual record. More importantly, the Navy had paid in advance months earlier for Eleanor's design. The money had never appeared in Blackwater's accounts. £4,000, Eleanor said. Harcourt nodded. Enough money to make the supposedly failing shipyard comfortably solvent. Where did it go? That, Harcourt replied, is what we must discover. Sebastian stood at the far end of the room. He looked ill. Eleanor did not comfort him. The false accounts had persuaded him, but Vale could not have taken Blackwater without Sebastian's signature. That responsibility remained his. Mercer awakened shortly before noon. Weakly, he explained that Crown Maritime Supply was not a real supplier. Payments had been routed through 3 accounts before reaching a London bank. Vale? Eleanor asked. Mercer shook his head. Not only Vale. He reached beneath his bandaged shirt and produced a small brass key. Blackwater Customs Warehouse, Box 32. What is inside? The payment instructions. A bell rang outside. Once, twice, then rapidly. Jacob rushed into the room. The prototype! Eleanor reached the window. Men were already towing the vessel toward open water. Her blood chilled. The trial isn't until tomorrow, Harcourt swore. No Admiralty officer authorized this. Vale had stopped waiting. If the ship survived, he could claim success. If it failed, the altered drawings would leave Eleanor responsible. She ran. The harbor erupted into confusion. Workers shouted from the pier while the prototype moved steadily toward the channel behind 2 tugboats. Eleanor spotted Thomas aboard the nearest tug. Thomas! He saw her and threw a line toward the dock. Eleanor caught it. Sebastian seized her arm. You cannot go out there. She pulled free. That ship carries 12 men. Let Harcourt handle it. Harcourt doesn't know the hull. She stepped onto the tug. Sebastian stared at her for 1 second, then jumped aboard after her. Eleanor did not argue. They reached the prototype before it entered deeper water. The altered frame had already begun taking strain. Eleanor heard it immediately. A dull crack beneath the forward deck. Unload the guns, she shouted. The officer aboard hesitated. Vale ordered, Vale is not here. Another crack sounded. This one louder. Sebastian turned pale. Eleanor ordered every man toward the stern, while the tug pulled the vessel toward shallow water. Then the forward frame split. The deck dropped violently. Men fell. Water rushed through the open seams. Jump! Eleanor screamed. They abandoned the vessel seconds before the bow sank onto the muddy bottom. No one died. Standing waist-deep in freezing harbor water, Sebastian watched the ship Eleanor had warned him about break apart. He finally had nothing left to say. That evening, Eleanor used Mercer's key. Customs Warehouse Box 32 contained invoices, bank instructions, and copies of letters. She recognized Vale's signature immediately. Then she found another name, Lord Pembroke, Sebastian's uncle. The man who had spent years urging Sebastian toward Parliament and insisting Eleanor's shipyard was a humiliation to the family. But the final document was worse. It showed the missing Admiralty payment transferred through Crown Maritime Supply. Half went to Vale. The other half had been deposited into an account established for Sebastian's parliamentary campaign. Eleanor stared at the paper. Sebastian had insisted he knew nothing about the scheme. Perhaps that was true. But someone had financed his ambition with stolen money and used his own wife to pay for it. Then she saw the date of the first transfer. It had occurred 3 months before the sale, before Vale's warnings, before the false debts, before Sebastian had begun demanding that she surrender Blackwater. This had been planned much earlier than any of them realized, and at the bottom of the instruction was a handwritten authorization. Eleanor knew the handwriting. She had seen it on family Christmas cards for 9 years. Lady Margaret Pembroke, Sebastian's aunt, the woman who had arranged their marriage. Eleanor read Lady Margaret's authorization twice. Sebastian stood opposite her in the warehouse, staring at his aunt's signature. She funded my campaign, with money stolen from Blackwater. I never knew. That may save you from criminal guilt, Eleanor replied. It does not excuse what you did to me. Vale had exploited Sebastian's ambition, but Sebastian had still chosen to humiliate her, sell her inheritance, and ignore her warnings. Admiral Harcourt examined the documents. This can suspend Vale's naval contracts, but it doesn't prove the entire conspiracy, Eleanor agreed. Lady Margaret cared little about ships. There had to be another reason she wanted Blackwater. The answer arrived the next morning. Parliament was opening an inquiry into naval procurement, and Blackwater's failed prototype would be examined publicly. The first witness accused of supplying defective designs was Eleanor. The hearing began in 3 days. Sebastian crushed the notice. I'll testify that you warned me. After telling everyone I was incapable, his face tightened. I deserve that. Yes, Eleanor took back the notice. But this is larger than our marriage now. Mercer provided the missing motive. Lady Margaret had been requesting confidential information about Eleanor's BA-17 design long before the sale. The shallow draft vessel could be adapted into an entire class of naval ships. If its trials succeeded, the design would be worth a fortune in future contracts. Margaret's scheme suddenly became clear. Make Blackwater appear insolvent. Use Sebastian's political ambitions to turn him against Eleanor. Have him sell the yard cheaply to Vale. Then erase Eleanor's authorship and claim BA-17 as Vale's invention. Sebastian had not created the conspiracy, but without his signature, it could never have worked. There is still a problem for them, Eleanor said. Mercer nodded. Your load tables. Vale possessed drawings, but not the final calculations required to construct BA-17 safely. Those were hidden inside an old navigation case at Eleanor's mother's cottage near Dover. If Vale discovered that, the remaining evidence would disappear. Eleanor prepared to leave immediately. Sebastian followed her toward the carriage. No, she said. Margaret has already burned your archive and taken Mercer once. And now you want to protect me? He held her gaze. I want to prevent more damage caused by my choices. For once, he had named his guilt without demanding forgiveness. Eleanor allowed him to follow in a separate carriage. They reached the cottage near dusk. The front door was open. Inside, furniture had been overturned. The navigation case was gone. Eleanor, Sebastian's voice came from the study. Thomas lay unconscious beside the desk, blood running from his temple. He's alive, Sebastian said. Eleanor spotted muddy footprints leading out the rear door. A carriage was disappearing along the coastal road. They mounted 2 horses and followed. Near an abandoned toll house, they found the carriage standing empty. Lady Margaret's crest marked its door. The stolen navigation case sat on the seat. Don't touch it, Eleanor said. It was too obvious. Beneath the case was an envelope bearing her name. Inside lay a copied page from BA-17 and a message. Withdraw every accusation at the parliamentary hearing, and Mercer lives. Eleanor's blood chilled. They've taken him again, Sebastian said, but she was studying the copied calculation. A tiny mark beside one measurement belonged to an early version of BA-17, a version only Eleanor and her father had possessed. Someone else must have received a copy before his death. She turned the page over. 4 faint words had been impressed into the paper from another document. Pembroke Dock, Warehouse 7. Eleanor looked toward Sebastian. The kidnappers had made one mistake. They've just told us where Mercer is. They reached Pembroke Dock shortly after midnight. Warehouse 7 stood at the far end of the quay, separated from the occupied buildings by stacks of timber and abandoned rigging. Eleanor saw 2 guards outside. Sebastian caught her arm before she moved closer. If they see you, Mercer dies. Then distract them. Sebastian looked at her for a moment, then understood. He rode openly toward the main gate, while Eleanor slipped behind the warehouses. His Grace, the Duke of Ashbourne, Sebastian called loudly. I demand to speak with whoever commands this dock. Both guards moved toward him. Eleanor found a side window with a broken latch and climbed inside. The warehouse smelled of tar and seawater. She followed a faint cough. Mercer was tied to a chair behind several crates. His face was bruised, but he was conscious. Your Grace? Quiet. Eleanor cut the rope with a rigging knife. Can you walk? I think so. Before they reached the window, the main doors opened. Lady Margaret entered. Vale followed her. Eleanor pulled Mercer behind the crates. You should have destroyed the clerk when you first found him, Margaret said. Vale's voice was tense. Murder creates questions, and a living witness creates testimony. Eleanor felt Mercer stiffen beside her. Margaret continued. The hearing begins tomorrow. Once Eleanor is blamed for the failed vessel, Ashbourne will have no choice but to distance himself from her publicly. And the patent? Parliament will never grant control of a naval design to a woman blamed for nearly killing sailors. There it was, the entire purpose. Destroy Eleanor's credibility, then seize BA-17 through Vale's company. Vale lowered his voice. What about Sebastian? My nephew will survive scandal. He always chooses ambition when frightened. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. Margaret knew Sebastian because Sebastian had repeatedly proven her right. Then Mercer shifted. A loose metal hook fell from a crate. The clang echoed through the warehouse. Silence. Vale turned. Who's there? Eleanor grabbed Mercer's arm. Run! They burst from hiding. Vale shouted. Mercer reached the side window first. Eleanor pushed him through, but Vale caught the back of her cloak. She twisted free, leaving the fabric in his hand. Then Sebastian crashed through the main doorway, with the dock guards behind him. Let her go. Vale stopped. Lady Margaret stared at Sebastian. You fool. Do you understand what you're destroying? Sebastian looked at his aunt. My political future? Your name? Your influence? Everything I built for you. No, he said. Everything Eleanor paid for. Margaret's expression hardened. Do not become righteous now. You signed the papers. You called your own wife incompetent before half the county. Sebastian flinched. Eleanor watched him carefully. Margaret was right. Exposing her would expose him too. Sebastian could still retreat. Instead, he looked toward the guards. Detain Sir Edmund. Vale laughed. On what authority? On mine until Admiral Harcourt arrives. Margaret stepped closer to her nephew. If you testify tomorrow, every newspaper in London will know that your parliamentary campaign was financed with stolen naval funds. Sebastian's face went pale. I know, and you will lose everything. He glanced at Eleanor. I already destroyed something more valuable, because I was afraid of losing everything else. Eleanor said nothing. Regret was not repair. Not yet. By dawn, Harcourt had taken Mercer into naval protection. Vale was questioned but released temporarily. The documents established fraud, yet the evidence still needed to be formally presented before the committee. Lady Margaret disappeared before officers could detain her. That worried Eleanor. Margaret still possessed the copied BA-17 drawings, and someone had given her Eleanor's father's early version. Mercer finally answered that mystery. Your father had a partner, he said. Eleanor frowned. My father owned Blackwater alone. Not at first. He explained that 20 years earlier, Henry Bellamy had accepted money from an investor when the yard nearly collapsed. That investor had received copies of experimental designs as security. Who? Mercer looked at her. Lord Pembroke, Sebastian's uncle, Margaret's husband. The conspiracy had not begun with Eleanor's marriage. It had begun with Blackwater itself, but something still did not fit. If Pembroke already possessed my father's designs, why did they need me? Because BA-17 isn't your father's design. No, you completed it. Mercer nodded. They had the foundation. You created the part worth stealing. Eleanor finally understood. Her marriage to Sebastian had placed Blackwater within reach of the Pembrokes. Perhaps that had never been accidental. Hours later, Eleanor entered the parliamentary committee chamber carrying Mercer's ledger, the false invoices, the original Admiralty contract, and the altered calculations. Sebastian entered separately. Every seat was occupied. Vale sat with his solicitor. Lady Margaret was nowhere to be seen. The chairman called the hearing to order. Then a clerk hurried inside and whispered into his ear. His expression changed. Before examining the failure of BA-17, he announced, the committee has received new evidence concerning the Duchess of Ashbourne. Eleanor felt the room shift. 2 officers carried in a locked wooden case. The chairman broke its seal. Inside were dozens of Blackwater documents. He lifted the first. This appears to be an original instruction, ordering unauthorized structural alterations to the prototype. Eleanor recognized her signature at the bottom, a perfect imitation. Then the chairman read the date. It placed the order 2 weeks before Sebastian sold Blackwater. Vale smiled across the chamber. The forgery made it appear that Eleanor herself had altered the ship, and unless she could disprove it before the committee, every piece of evidence she carried would look like the desperate defense of a guilty woman. Eleanor did not look at Vale. She looked at the forged order. May I examine it? The chairman handed it to her. The signature was excellent. The terminology was correct. Even the paper came from Blackwater's stationery. But whoever created it had copied her handwriting rather than her habits. Who submitted this? An anonymous source. Then ask Sir Edmund whether he believes it genuine. Vale rose confidently. I do. Eleanor turned toward him. Excellent. She placed the document on the table. The order specifies that the forward frames be reinforced with Whitby iron. Yes. Blackwater stopped using Whitby iron 14 months before this date. Vale's smile faded. Eleanor continued. I changed suppliers after discovering impurities in 2 shipments. Every genuine construction order after that date specifies Sheffield iron. Harcourt immediately requested the procurement records. They confirmed it. A murmur spread through the chamber. The forgery had cracked, but Eleanor was not finished. The signature may resemble mine. The instruction does not. The chairman ordered the document retained for investigation. Vale leaned toward his solicitor. For the first time, he looked frightened. Mercer testified next. He described the false supplier accounts, the stolen Admiralty payment, and the effort to make Blackwater appear insolvent. Then Sebastian was called. Eleanor watched him take the oath. Did you publicly state that your wife had never designed a seaworthy vessel? The chairman asked. Yes. Was that statement true? Sebastian paused. No. Vale stared at him. Sebastian continued. My wife corrected the structural defects of the Resolute and developed BA-17. I knew she possessed engineering ability when I said otherwise. Then why did you discredit her? Pride, political ambition, and because believing Sir Edmund was easier than admitting my wife understood Blackwater better than I did. The chamber went silent. Sebastian did not ask Eleanor to forgive him. He simply placed his disgrace where it belonged. I also signed the sale without allowing her to challenge the financial evidence. That decision enabled this fraud. The chairman turned toward Eleanor. Your Grace, can you prove BA-17 is your work? Yes. She produced her surviving calculations. But the decisive load tables were still missing. Vale knew it. These are drafts, his solicitor argued. They do not establish authorship of the completed design. He was right. Eleanor needed something stronger. Then Admiral Harcourt entered, carrying a weathered leather tube. We found this aboard the damaged prototype. Inside was a set of construction measurements signed by 3 Blackwater master shipwrights months before Vale purchased the yard. Eleanor's initials appeared on every page. More importantly, the measurements matched her safe version of BA-17, not the sabotaged vessel. Vale stood abruptly. This proves nothing. It proves enough to arrest you for fraud pending further investigation, Harcourt said. Officers moved toward him, but Eleanor was watching the gallery. A woman in black had risen near the rear door. Lady Margaret. Their eyes met. Margaret turned and disappeared into the corridor. Eleanor followed. By the time she reached the street, a carriage was already racing away. Then Jacob came running from the opposite entrance. Your Grace! His face was white. Blackwater Yard is on fire. Eleanor stopped. Not the archive this time. The whole yard? Jacob nodded. And the main dry dock is full. She understood instantly. The dry dock contained 2 nearly completed naval vessels. If the fire reached the tar stores, Blackwater would be destroyed, along with whatever evidence Margaret had failed to erase. Eleanor gathered her skirts and ran toward the waiting carriage. Sebastian followed. She turned on him. Do not come because you think saving my yard will save our marriage. His expression tightened. I know. Then why? Because Blackwater should never have needed saving from a decision I made. For once, Eleanor had no argument. They climbed aboard. Behind them, Parliament was beginning to uncover the fraud. Ahead, black smoke was already rising over Blackwater, and somewhere inside the burning yard remained her father's original records, the one piece of evidence that could reveal whether her marriage itself had been part of Margaret's plan from the beginning. The smoke was visible long before they reached Blackwater. By the time Eleanor's carriage stopped, flames had consumed the eastern warehouse and were spreading toward the rigging sheds. Workers formed bucket lines from the harbor, while burning embers swept across the yard. Eleanor jumped down. Move the tar barrels first, she shouted. Roll them toward the water. Men immediately obeyed. Sebastian began removing his coat. Eleanor caught his arm. The dry dock gates. He understood. If the fire weakened the supports while the dock remained drained, the 2 unfinished vessels could collapse and block the basin. Worse, burning debris might trap men below. Sebastian ran toward the control mechanism with several workers. Eleanor headed for her father's old workshop. Jacob stopped her. You cannot go inside. The partnership records are there. The roof is burning. If Margaret started this fire, those records are why. Jacob swore under his breath and followed. Inside, smoke had already filled the upper corridor. Eleanor wrapped cloth around her mouth and reached the loft. Most boxes had been disturbed during the earlier search, but one heavy cabinet remained bolted to the floor. Her father had once told her, almost jokingly, that every shipyard needed somewhere to hide the truth from bankers. She had never understood what he meant. Now she did. Behind the cabinet was a narrow iron compartment. Eleanor forced it open. Inside lay a bundle of old contracts. The first bore Lord Pembroke's signature. The second nearly stopped her breathing. It was correspondence between her father and Lady Margaret, written months before Eleanor ever met Sebastian. She read only enough to understand. Margaret had repeatedly offered to erase Blackwater's old debt if Henry Bellamy encouraged a marriage between Eleanor and Sebastian. Her father had refused. One sentence had been underlined in his reply. My daughter is not collateral for your family's ambitions. A beam cracked overhead. Eleanor! Jacob shouted. She shoved the letters beneath her coat. They barely reached the stairs before part of the loft collapsed behind them. Outside, the situation had worsened. The flames had reached the dry dock. but water was pouring through the open gates. Sebastian stood waist-deep beside the mechanism, helping two workers turn the emergency wheel. "Clear the dock!" Eleanor shouted. The rising water lifted the unfinished vessels before the burning support structure could crush them. Minutes later, the warehouse roof collapsed. Blackwater survived, barely. Admiral Harcourt arrived with naval marines shortly before dawn. Near the burned eastern gate, they discovered an abandoned carriage containing oil cans and cloth soaked in spirits. One canister carried the mark of a Pembroke estate supplier. Margaret could no longer claim coincidence, but she had disappeared. Eleanor sat inside the surviving office, while Harcourt examined her father's letters. Sebastian stood near the window. "He tried to keep us apart," Eleanor said quietly. "My father knew Margaret wanted this marriage." Sebastian turned. "I didn't. I believe you." The words offered less comfort than he expected, because ignorance did not undo his later choices. "Margaret arranged our first meeting," he said. "Yes. She encouraged me to believe Blackwater embarrassed my political allies." "Yes." Sebastian closed his eyes. "And every time you defended the yard, I treated it as proof that she was right." Eleanor looked at him steadily. "She built the road, Sebastian. You chose to walk down it." He nodded. "I know. That was the difference now." He no longer blamed Margaret for decisions that belonged to him. But acknowledgement was only the beginning. Eleanor returned to the letters. One document remained unopened. Inside was a copy of the original investment agreement between Henry Bellamy and Lord Pembroke. Pembroke had financed Blackwater 20 years earlier in exchange for repayment with interest. Nothing unusual, until Eleanor reached the final clause. If Henry died before the debt was settled, Pembroke could claim a financial interest in the yard, but only if Blackwater passed outside Henry's direct bloodline. Eleanor read it again. If Eleanor remained the lawful owner, Pembroke's claim was worthless. But if she surrendered Blackwater through her husband, everything changed. Margaret had needed Eleanor to lose control voluntarily or through Sebastian's marital authority. The marriage had placed the only person capable of transferring Blackwater directly beside her, and Sebastian had eventually done exactly what Margaret required. "That's why she waited," Eleanor whispered. Harcourt looked up. "Waited for what?" "For Sebastian to choose his ambition over me." Margaret could not simply steal the yard. She had spent years weakening the marriage until Sebastian would hand it to her willingly. A naval courier arrived before sunrise. Lady Margaret had been found. She had gone directly to the Pembroke estate, but she was not fleeing. She was preparing a legal counterattack. Her solicitors had filed an emergency claim stating that the destruction of BA-17 proved Blackwater was financially insolvent and unsafe under Eleanor's management. If the claim succeeded, the yard could be placed under temporary receivership before Parliament finished its inquiry. The hearing was scheduled for that afternoon. Eleanor stood. "Then we finish this today." Sebastian looked at her. "What do you need from me? Not what should we do, not let me handle it. What do you need?" Eleanor considered him. "The truth. You have it. All of it." His face tightened. She meant the dinner, the sale, the warnings he ignored, the political money, everything that might destroy his reputation. Sebastian nodded. "All of it." When Eleanor arrived at the hearing, the corridor was packed with reporters. Lady Margaret waited inside, dressed perfectly in black. She showed no sign of a woman whose conspiracy was collapsing. Instead, she smiled when Eleanor entered. "You saved the shipyard." "Yes." "How sentimental." Eleanor placed her father's letters on the evidence table. Margaret's smile weakened. "You should have burned the iron compartment too." For the first time, fear entered Lady Margaret's eyes. The chairman called the room to order. Eleanor opened her father's final letter. Before she could read it, Admiral Harcourt stepped quickly toward her. "Your Grace." He handed her a sealed Admiralty dispatch. A naval vessel had intercepted a small ship attempting to leave for France that morning. Sir Edmund Vale had been aboard. So had several cases of Blackwater documents, and one passenger traveling under a false name. Eleanor read the name twice. Nathaniel Mercer. She looked toward Harcourt. Mercer was under naval protection. He disappeared 3 hours ago. Eleanor felt the entire case shift beneath her feet. Either Mercer had betrayed them from the beginning, or someone was now making certain it appeared that he had. And Lady Margaret was smiling again. The hearing dissolved into whispers. Lady Margaret's solicitor rose immediately. Mr. Mercer was the Duchess's principal witness. If he was fleeing England with Sir Edmund, his testimony cannot be trusted. Margaret had found her counterattack. Eleanor read the Admiralty dispatch again. Something bothered her. Mercer had been injured badly enough to require assistance walking, yet the report described him boarding the vessel shortly before dawn without resistance. "Where is he now?" Eleanor asked. "Naval custody," Harcourt replied. "I want to see him." Mercer was brought to the committee chamber an hour later. He looked exhausted rather than guilty. "I didn't flee," he said. "Vale's men told the guards that Admiral Harcourt had ordered my transfer." "Why did you go with them?" "They carried naval papers." Harcourt examined those orders. His signature had been forged. Another forgery. But Eleanor saw something else. "Mercer, did you know the cases aboard the ship contained Blackwater records?" "No." "Then why take you?" Mercer hesitated. "Because I know where the money ends." The room quieted. Crown Maritime Supply had transferred stolen Blackwater funds through several accounts, but Mercer had traced the final destination before his first disappearance. Not merely to Vale, not merely to Sebastian's campaign. A large portion had gone into a private Pembroke trust, controlled by Lady Margaret. She had been using Blackwater to finance political influence for years. Harcourt placed the banking records beside Eleanor's father's letters. The evidence chain was finally becoming complete. The false insolvency, the stolen Admiralty advance, the altered prototype, the forged construction order, the attempt to destroy the archive. And now the money. Lady Margaret remained remarkably calm. "You possess papers," she said. "You do not possess proof that I ordered sabotage." Eleanor looked at the charred BA-17 calculation. Margaret was right. Financial fraud could destroy her influence, but deliberately endangering sailors was another charge entirely. They still needed the person who altered the design. Then Jacob Bell entered. Beside him walked a young Blackwater apprentice. Eleanor recognized him as Samuel Price. The boy looked terrified. "I saw it," Samuel said. On the night before the archive burned, Vale had ordered him to fetch tools from Eleanor's drafting room. Through the half-open door, Samuel saw Lady Margaret standing over BA-17, while Vale changed measurements. "She told him the ship only needed to fail," Samuel whispered, "not sink." Vale had asked what would happen if men were killed. Margaret had answered that Eleanor would carry the blame. For the first time, Lady Margaret lost her composure. "That boy is lying." "No," Eleanor said. "He's the witness you forgot." The chairman ordered Margaret detained pending formal investigation. She turned toward Sebastian. "Are you going to allow this?" Everyone watched him. Months earlier, that question would have worked. Sebastian rose. "You used me." Margaret's expression sharpened. "And you willingly believed everything I told you." "Yes." The answer silenced her. Sebastian continued. "That is why Eleanor lost her yard. That is why her name was disgraced. And that part belongs to me." He turned toward the committee. "I signed the transfer. I publicly lied about my wife's abilities, despite knowing better. I refused to investigate her warnings because protecting my political ambition mattered more to me than believing her." Reporters began writing furiously. Sebastian did not stop. "I withdraw every accusation I made against Eleanor Ashcombe. I surrender any claim to profits, patents, or control arising from Blackwater Yard, and I will personally repay every penny of stolen money that entered my campaign." Eleanor watched without expression. This was not absolution. It was repair finally beginning. The chairman ordered Vale and Margaret held for further proceedings and suspended every disputed Blackwater transfer. Then he turned to Eleanor. "Tomorrow morning, Parliament will determine ownership of the yard and authorship of BA-17. Tomorrow." One final question remained. The law still contained the transfer bearing Sebastian's signature. Margaret had been exposed, but Eleanor had to prove that Blackwater legally belonged to her before anyone else could control it again. Outside the chamber, Sebastian approached her. "What happens if the committee restores the yard?" "I rebuild it. And us?" Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "That is not Parliament's decision." Then Jacob hurried from the records room, carrying one final document recovered from the cases aboard Vale's ship. "Your Grace." He handed it to Eleanor. It was her original marriage settlement. Not the copy Sebastian's solicitor had used. The original. A clause had been removed from the later version. Eleanor read it slowly, then again. Her father had anticipated everything. Blackwater Yard could never legally be sold, mortgaged, or transferred by Eleanor's husband without her separate written consent. Sebastian's sale had never been valid. Eleanor looked toward the committee doors. Tomorrow's hearing would not decide whether the Duke of Ashbourne should return her shipyard. It would establish that he had never possessed the right to take it from her at all. The final hearing began the next morning. Eleanor entered carrying the original marriage settlement. Lady Margaret and Sir Edmund Vale sat under guard. Sebastian remained on the opposite side of the chamber, without advisors or solicitors. When the chairman asked Eleanor to present her claim, she placed the settlement on the table. My father protected Blackwater from exactly what happened. The missing clause was read aloud. No husband could sell, mortgage, or transfer Blackwater Yard without Eleanor's independent written consent. She had never given it. Sebastian's sale to Vale had therefore been invalid from the beginning. Vale rose angrily. A technicality cannot erase a signed contract. No, Eleanor answered, but fraud can. She laid out the evidence in sequence. Mercer's ledger showed fabricated expenses through Crown Maritime Supply. Bank records traced the missing Admiralty advance into Vale's accounts, the Pembroke Trust, and Sebastian's political fund. Eleanor's original calculations proved BA-17 had been safe before its measurements were altered. Samuel Price testified that he had witnessed Vale changing those measurements under Margaret's instruction. Finally, Eleanor produced her father's correspondence. Margaret had tried to obtain Blackwater through Eleanor's marriage years before the sale. The conspiracy had required Sebastian's cooperation, not his knowledge of the entire scheme, his willingness to distrust his wife. The chairman turned toward him. "Your Grace?" Sebastian stood. "I signed the transfer." He did not make excuses. "I knew my wife had successfully contributed to naval engineering, yet I publicly denied her ability. I ignored her accounts because accepting Sir Edmund's version served my ambition. When Eleanor warned me the ship was unsafe, I refused to stop its trial." He looked toward the reporters. "I disgraced her publicly. The correction should therefore be public as well." Eleanor remained still. Months earlier, Sebastian would have protected the Ashbourne name above everything. Now he was damaging that name himself to restore hers. It mattered, but it did not erase what had happened. The committee ruled before noon. The transfer of Blackwater was void. Eleanor remained its lawful owner. Her authorship of BA-17 was formally recognized, and all future Admiralty negotiations concerning the design would be conducted directly with her representatives. Vale was remanded for fraud, forgery, theft of Admiralty funds, and conspiracy connected to the sabotage. Lady Margaret faced charges arising from financial fraud, evidence destruction, attempted coercion, and the deliberate alteration of a naval vessel. Lord Pembroke's involvement would be investigated separately. Sebastian resigned his parliamentary candidacy that afternoon. He ordered every penny diverted into his campaign returned from his personal estate. Then he transferred additional funds to compensate the Blackwater workers who had lost wages during Vale's control. Eleanor had requested none of it. That was why she allowed it. It was restitution, not courtship. 3 months later, Blackwater sounded like itself again. Hammers struck oak. Saws moved through timber. The burned eastern workshop was being rebuilt with wider windows and stone fire breaks. Above Eleanor's drafting table rested the completed plans for the corrected BA-17. The Admiralty had commissioned 2 new vessels. This time the contract bore her name. Jacob knocked on the open door. "Someone is waiting at the gate." Eleanor looked outside. Sebastian stood where she herself had once been stopped after he sold the yard. He did not enter. Eleanor walked to him. "I came to tell you the final compensation payment was made today," he said. "Thank you." He looked beyond her toward the yard. "I once thought admitting your ability somehow diminished mine." Eleanor waited. "I loved being admired more than I loved being honest with you." It was perhaps the first apology he had given her without attempting to soften himself inside it. "I cannot ask you to forget that. No, or forgive it. That is mine to decide. Yes." He handed her a small brass key, the old Blackwater gate key he had once allowed Vale to take from her. "I found it among the things recovered from his office." Eleanor closed her fingers around it. Sebastian stepped back. "If you ever wish to speak to me, I will come. If you don't, I will understand." For the first time, he left the decision entirely with her. Eleanor watched him walk away. She did not call him back, not yet. Perhaps one day she would decide whether the man Sebastian was becoming deserved a place beside the woman she had become. But she would never again build her life around that possibility. Eleanor returned to the yard. Jacob was waiting beside the new gates. "Ready, Your Grace?" Eleanor placed the brass key into the lock herself. The gates opened. Beyond them stood her craftsman, her drafting room, and the first keel of the new BA-17 resting beneath the morning light. This time, no man's name covered hers. Eleanor stepped through first.